TV, the voice of college football, coming your way each and every week on a Friday at noon Eastern time. This is one of my most favorite segments of the week as we run down the betting lines. This time for week 3 with Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info. So you catch Steve and his services there at prosportsinfo.com. Steve, how you doing today?
Hey, Mark, doing well.
Appreciate you jumping on board, of course, and always learn something about how to try to get the edge on Vegas. So, looking back at the first 2 weeks of the season, specifically week 2, was there anything that jumped out at you in regards to certain trends or stats or scores that may have caught you by surprise?
Well, first thing I'll mention, we talked about this last week, is I think the odds are as tight and as sharp as they've ever been. We've seen more games fall within a couple points of the point spread than I can remember in recent memory, and it's not a surprise. Year after year, the odds makers get sharper, the sports bettors get sharper with technology, computers, logarithms, whatever you want to look at. But yeah, it's just amazing to me how close some of these marquee games especially have been. We talked about that LSU Texas game last week. It opened at 4.5, and how the line was rising. It was 6.5, and it hit 7 in some spots. It was hanging right on that 7, that key number, probably the most spotlight, biggest game of the week. The A&M Clemson game got tight there down the stretch on that 17, 18-point spread. So it's something to keep an eye on, and it shows why you have to keep in mind the point spread. We talk about you can like one team or like the other team, but if the odds aren't right, if the number's not right, that dictates if you make a play or not. Other thing that jumped out to me, the one game I used my under-the-radar play, Oregon last week. We talked about how Nevada had that 5-0 turnover edge. We're kind of lucky to beat Purdue. Oregon had the last-second loss, and boy, they steamrolled them. That's something I like to look for going forward, is those misleading scores, especially based on turnovers. And then the contrarian, the sharp square divide game we talked about last week. Boy, did that one jump off the board. Maryland, we talked about how everyone loves Syracuse, how nobody could understand how Syracuse went from a slight favorite to an underdog. Well, I guess we know why now. And I thought that was probably the most interesting result of the week, was Maryland's blowout win over Syracuse.
Yeah, which also brings into question what we can expect from Maryland going forward, because they've given us this type of flash performance in the past, specifically Ohio State barely losing 52-51 in overtime, and of course the 2 Texas wins in week 1. So we know that Maryland is capable. We'll see if this is a different Maryland team over time that can stay consistent. This is an interesting game just because they got blasted by Temple last year. They come in red hot. They go to Temple. They would appear to be the much better team based on very early results, but they're a 7-point favorite. And just I'm going to be fascinated to see whether Maryland can maintain some consistency. And 7 points is obviously fairly substantial.
Yeah, and we know nothing about Temple. Their only game this year was against Canisius, a 56-12 win against Canisius. And as you know, Mark, I follow 1AA FCS pretty closely. I honestly did not know Canisius had a football team, and I assume it's 1AA, and I follow it very close. But I don't remember hearing much about Canisius over the years. So, yeah, I mean, Temple basically hasn't played yet. Maryland played Howard. That wasn't much of a game, but they still won 79-0 as a 30-point favorite. And then, of course, the 43-point win against Syracuse last week. The offense has now put up 142 points in 2 games. The total opened 62.5. It's up to 66.5. And you can see for good reason that Maryland offense looks explosive. And Temple did put up some good points in their first game, although they haven't really played anybody yet.
Steve, the point spread giveth and it taketh away, and the backdoor cover does the same. I gotta mention that I benefited from the Texas A&M score with 2 seconds left and taking the points. Clemson thoroughly dominated that game, had control of the game, could have tacked on other scores, so I benefited there. On the other hand, I took Buffalo in 31.5. They had a 6-point lead against Penn State at halftime, gave up 38 consecutive points, and boom, I get burned at the end.
Yeah, I actually liked Penn State in that game, by the way, so I did benefit from that one. I talked about last week how Oregon was a tough loss for me. So you're right. It does give and it takes away. It evens out in the long run. And as we also touched on last week, it's more important to feel like you handicap the games correctly. You let those things kind of fall where they will. But it's incredible how sharp the lines have been. I had 2 big favorites last week, Penn State and Texas Tech. They both covered by 0.5 point, give it up over 4.5, 5 touchdowns. That's how sharp the odds have been.
All right, Steve Merrill joining us from Pro Sports Info, prosportsinfo.com. We encourage you to go jump over there. We bring them on every Friday during the college football season to highlight the three biggest games of the week and also give a bit of a wild card under the radar pick. So it's a week in which we've got a lot of decent matchups, like interesting games, but no marquee games. So I'm doing my best to select three that kind of stand out. I think we have to go to Florida and Kentucky in the SEC. It's an SEC opener for both teams. Florida lost for the first time in 34 years to Kentucky last year. The Wildcats, a much different look, much different team, different quarterback, running back, and defense for the most part this year at home against Florida. I've seen a line of 8 points with the Gators, the favorite.
Yeah, I'm seeing about 8, 8.5. It's a pretty big number. I mean, this was a good Kentucky team last year, as we know, and they're 2-0 this year. Florida also off to a 2-0 straight up start, but Kentucky's actually been the better point spread team. Kentucky's 2-0 against the spread. Florida's 0-1 with a push last week. You talk about another tight line. They're a 45-point favorite against Tennessee Martin. They win 45-0. Just another example of how incredibly sharp these odds have been this year, especially for huge favorites. That's what gets me. You would think there's more margin of error when you're talking about a 4 or 5 touchdown spread, but the odds makers nailed that Tennessee Martin game last week. Florida did what they had to. They put up over 500 yards, over 200 yards rushing, 300 yards passing. Very balanced attack. It was a good spot for them after the big Miami win. They had a week off. Tennessee Martin. So basically, they've had 2 weeks here to prepare for Kentucky, so they should be ready. They do have Tennessee on deck next week at home. In fact, this is their only true road game in the first 5 games this season, so it should be a focused spot for the Gators. Problem, though, for me is that the line looks inflated. 8, 8.5 is a big number. I could see Florida winning this game, but Kentucky staying within the touchdown.
All right, folks, you can get my picks down at the Voice of College Football Community. You see the link below in the description section. Get my picks right there, but I'm not a pro. This is the pro right here. That's why we bring on Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info each and every week. But I got to say, Steve, even though I've got my picks elsewhere, I'm going to clue in some folks on what I'm thinking on this game. And it's Arizona State and Michigan State. I was just surprised to see the line. I saw it at 15 today with the Spartans, home favorite against a team that upset them last year in Tempe.
Yeah, this line actually opened as low as 11 last week or on Sunday. It's now 14.5, 15, so it has crossed some key numbers. I still like Michigan State, though. That is some heavy, sharp money that's been on Michigan State early in the week, and I agree with the move. You referenced the revenge spot. That's just one of the many angles I like in this game. Also like the fact that Michigan State put up 51 points against Western Michigan last week. They were a 15.5-point favorite, very similar line to this game. They won 51-17. Meanwhile, Arizona State might be 2-0 straight up, 2 home wins, but they did not cover either game. In fact, they didn't come close to covering. They were a 24-point favorite against Kent, won by 23. So I guess they came close there. But last week's win against Sacramento State, very non-impressive. A 19-7 win is a 35-point favorite. Not only did they only win by 12 points, but they only scored 19 points as a 35-point favorite. That's always a huge red flag for me when a team doesn't even score enough for be the point spread. And now playing their first true road game of the season, I think this is a substantial step up in class. And I like Michigan State here. I think they have a balanced attack, and I think they have the revenge motive on top of it.
All right, you're not making me feel too good about liking the Sun Devils going to Michigan State. That spread just jumped out of me. I thought it was going to be 8 or 10, something in that range. We've got a really nice matchup, Big 12 versus the Big 10. They play every year. It's typically not a competitive series as Iowa's the much better program, but in recent years, Iowa State has jumped up and finished in the top 25 a couple straight years. Iowa State, somewhat of a pick'em game. Iowa's about a 1.5 to 2 point favorite, something in that range in Ames.
Yeah, we talk about sharp money. It's definitely been on the under in this game. This total has moved several points. It opened as high as 47. It's now down to 42, 42.5. This should be one of the lowest scoring games of the week. 42, a very low total for college football nowadays. And it's a tight point spread. Iowa State actually opened as about a 1-point home favorite. They're now a slight dog. So we've seen a line reversal in this game. Iowa now a slight 1 to 1.5 point road favorite. So there's been a little bit of money on Iowa, and there's definitely been some money on the under here. I would agree with both moves. I see no reason to buck those. Hawkeyes have looked very solid in their first 2 wins at home against Miami of Ohio, and more importantly against Rutgers last week. A 38-0 win as a 17-point favorite. first true road game of the season, but this is an in-state rivalry game, so I don't think the travel's as much of a factor. I think there'll be a good fan base for both teams. And meanwhile, Iowa State, a weird scheduling spot to start. They had Northern Iowa, and then they had a bye week right after the first week. That actually, one regard, they have extra prep time. But I honestly think this early in the season, you're better off getting some games under your belt. And the fact that Iowa has an extra game against a Big Ten opponent in Rutgers, while Iowa State had to sit on the sidelines last week after playing a 1AA team, I think that actually could be the difference in this game. And that's why the Hawkeyes have seen some money coming on their way.
Final score last year to back up your over-under play, Iowa 13, Iowa State 3. 16 total points last year. Perfect weather conditions had nothing to do with it. These teams just get after each other in a very physical, heated rivalry. Steve, it's always interesting to get your take on another wild card game of sorts, maybe something from the group of five or anywhere in college football. Certainly, you usually come up with a pretty good look at a particular matchup.
Yeah, normally we take some under the radar teams. I'm actually going to use Notre Dame. So obviously they're not an under the radar team. They were a Final Four participant last year. But the reason I consider this an under the radar game is because they're playing New Mexico and they're a 34 and a half, 35-point favorite. So this is not a high profile game. But I like that. I think there's some value with Notre Dame for that reason. Irish obviously overperformed last year, better than expected. They weren't one of the four best teams in football. I had them about 7th or 8th. So I think they overachieved a bit. But I actually feel like they might be flying under the radar a little bit this season. And after a very poor defensive showing against Louisville in week 1, I look for a better bounce back performance here. Now, I mentioned how having that early bye week sometimes isn't beneficial. I think for Notre Dame, it actually will be. After giving up 249 rushing yards, 5.5 yards per carry against Louisville, I think that week off is going to be really good for Notre Dame. They're going to tighten up on defense. And New Mexico also had the week off after a lackluster win against Sam Houston State. By the way, they won that game by 8. They were only a 6-point favorite. So this is not a good New Mexico team. And we've talked about these big point spreads being tight. The line opened 37. It's now down to 34 and a half, 35. So I think we actually get some value now with the line dropping. And we're getting 5 touchdowns or less. I like Notre Dame here. I think they've got the motivation to win this game big after that lackluster defensive performance against Louisville. Now, they do have a game at Georgia on deck next week. That is a concern. And they probably did use some of that bye week prepping for the Bulldogs. But I'm not sure they can't help but win this game big as they're going to dominate the line of scrimmage.
All right, Steve Merrill from Pro Sports Info joining us each and every Friday. So lock it in. Each and every Friday during the college football season and on through the NFL playoffs and Super Bowl right here at Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, every Friday at noon Eastern time. And then catch all of his facts and figures and numbers and his services over on prosportsinfo.com. Steve, it's always a fascinating conversation. Always love to get your take on the weekend's play.
Thanks, Mark.
All right, Steve. Thank you